December 10, 1941. The South China Sea churned under a thick veil of monsoon rain. A convoy of Japanese transports pressed forward, their decks stacked with crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and hundreds of soldiers bound for the conquest of Malaya. To their escorts, sleek destroyers with banners snapping defiantly in the storm, this seemed like routine work. The Americans, still reeling from the thunderclap at Pearl Harbor just 3 days earlier, were not expected to strike back here. But beneath those dark waters, an unseen hunter lurked. The USS Seawolf slid silently through the deep, its crew huddled around the controls, sweat running down their faces in the stale, recycled air. The order came, fire one, a hiss, a shudder, and then silence. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Then, nothing. The torpedo vanished into the abyss, swallowed by the sea. A second was launched, then a third, still nothing. On the Seawolf's gauges, the detonators registered impact, but the warheads failed to explode. Above, the Japanese convoy continued forward, blissfully unaware. In Tokyo's naval circles, admirals would laugh at American torpedoes, mocking them as duds and water dragons with no teeth. They would not laugh forever. For the men inside the steel coffin of the submarine, the failure was more terrifying than enemy depth charges. They had stalked their prey with precision, risked discovery, and when the chance came, their weapons betrayed them. The tension in the control room was palpable, like a rope drawn to breaking point. Every sailor knew that if the enemy detected them now, their submarine could become a steel tomb. Above, Japanese lookouts scanned the waters half-heartedly, convinced the Americans posed no real threat. They were wrong, but for now they remained untouched, their convoy steaming onward into history. This was not an isolated failure. Across the Pacific, American submariners found themselves armed with weapons that refused to detonate, ran too deep, or veered wildly off course. Imagine the agony of a hunter whose bullets dissolve upon hitting their target. The Pacific theater was filled with moments of triumph and horror, but in those first months, it was also filled with bitter silence as explosions failed to roar. American submarines, designed to be wolves of the sea, were reduced to snapping dogs with broken teeth. Their captains filed report after report, filled with rage and disbelief, only to be met with skepticism from their superiors. Washington dismissed them as excuses for poor aim, cowardice, or inexperience. Yet beneath the waves, men knew the truth. Something was deeply wrong. The Japanese had long dismissed American naval innovation as inferior to their own traditions of steel, discipline, and precision. Their naval doctrine was rooted in the decisive battle, massive formations, and the crushing blow of aircraft carriers and battleships. Submarines, in their eyes, were auxiliaries useful for scouting, but hardly decisive. To them, the idea of American submarines prowling the ocean as a strategic threat seemed laughable, especially when the torpedoes themselves failed to explode. In the early days of the war, they sailed with confidence. Their convoys, though escorted, often carried an air of invulnerability. What enemy would waste steel on a weapon that did not work? And yet, whispers began to spread. American submarines kept appearing like ghosts, surfacing to attack and then vanishing. Crews reported wakes of torpedoes slicing through the water, sometimes striking hulls with a hollow clang but leaving no explosion. Japanese officers joked about friendly fish and American fireworks that never ignite. They laughed, yes, but some among them sensed danger. If the Americans ever solved their torpedo problem, the vast lifeline of the empire, spanning from the oil fields of Borneo to the factories of Japan, could become a graveyard of shattered ships. In those early months, fate seemed to mock the Americans at every turn. January 1942, off Balikpapan, a squadron of U.S. submarines crept upon a Japanese invasion fleet. One by one they fired their spreads of torpedoes, the deadly silver fish streaking toward fat, vulnerable transports. And yet, when they struck, the results were humiliating. Loud thuds, geysers of seawater, but no explosions. The submariners could only curse as Japanese troops continued to disembark unscathed. Some torpedoes, instead of striking, ran too deep, slipping harmlessly beneath the keels of their prey. Others spiraled off course, lost in the current. What should have been a massacre became a comedy of errors. but a comedy with deadly consequences for every failed attack. Thousands of enemy soldiers reached shore, reinforcing Japan's expanding empire. Imagine the despair of a submarine captain, ordered to halt the enemy's advance, but forced to watch helplessly as convoy after convoy delivered their cargoes of death. In one report, a commander wrote bitterly, "It is as though we are armed with clubs while the enemy marches unopposed." Another compared the Mark 14 torpedo to a sword without an edge, a gun without powder. These were not exaggerations. They were the lived experiences of men risking their lives only to be betrayed by faulty engineering and bureaucratic arrogance. Above water, Japanese officers continued their campaigns with almost arrogant ease. Convoys threaded through the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies, carrying the resources Japan so desperately needed: oil, rubber, tin, and food. Without these lifelines, the empire would wither. But for now, the lifelines remained intact. Each day, the rising sun flag advanced further across maps in Tokyo war rooms. And as long as American torpedoes failed, the submarines were dismissed as nuisances, not predators. Japanese admirals, sipping sake in wood-paneled chambers, mocked American technology, convinced that the empire's naval mastery would never be challenged beneath the waves. But storms were gathering. Beneath the laughter and arrogance, the Americans were relentless. Engineers in laboratories tore apart torpedo casings, tested detonators, measured depths. Submarine crews risked everything, firing test shots, sometimes even surfacing under fire just to recover duds for study. Slowly, piece by piece, the mystery unraveled. The Mark 14 torpedo, the pride of American ordnance, was revealed as a flawed creation. Its magnetic detonator unreliable, its depth-keeping system disastrously miscalibrated. It was as if the wolves had been fitted with muzzles by their own masters. Once these flaws were corrected, however, the wolves would be unchained, and when that moment came, the laughter in Tokyo would turn into silence. The opening months of the Pacific War thus played out with a cruel irony. The Japanese advanced across Asia, their convoys surging forward without fear, their admirals smug in their confidence. The Americans, battered and bloodied, held in their hands the very weapon that could have choked Japan's empire at birth, yet it was useless, broken by design. But history is not written by the failures of the beginning. It is written by the relentless pursuit of a solution. The submariners endured humiliation, but they did not break. The engineers labored through nights of frustration, but they did not surrender. And soon the ocean itself would become a battlefield where Japan's lifelines would bleed, ship by ship, convoy by convoy. In that December storm of 1941, as the Seawolf slipped away into the deep, her crew tasted bitter defeat. They had struck with courage, but their weapons had betrayed them. Above, the Japanese convoy continued, sails unbroken, laughter echoing through mess halls. Yet beneath that laughter lay a shadow they could not see. The day would come when American torpedoes would not fail. The day would come when those convoys, once so secure, would vanish into flame and smoke. The laughter of the admirals would be silenced by the thunder of exploding steel. By the dawn of 1942, the Pacific Ocean had become a vast arena of conquest and desperation. Japan's war machine surged forward with astonishing speed, sweeping across territories that had once seemed untouchable. The Philippines were under siege, British Malaya crumbled, and the Dutch East Indies, rich in oil and raw materials, fell into the rising tide of the rising sun. In Tokyo, victory banners unfurled across the empire, while in Washington, grim silence lingered in the halls of the Navy Department. America had been caught unprepared, its fleet crippled at Pearl Harbor, its armies scattered across islands now threatened by encirclement. Yet even in those darkest hours, planners knew that Japan's empire rested on fragile pillars, long thin lines of supply that stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. If those lifelines could be cut, the seemingly unstoppable advance might grind to a halt. This understanding formed the foundation of America's undersea campaign. Submarines, once considered auxiliaries in the shadow of battleships, suddenly stood at the center of strategy. Unlike surface fleets, they did not need bases, convoys, or air cover. A single submarine could lurk unseen in enemy waters for weeks, stalking prey with patient malice. The US Navy possessed nearly 50 operational submarines in the Pacific at the start of 1942, with more under construction. Small in number compared to Japan's vast navy, these vessels nevertheless held a potential far greater than their size suggested. They were America's hidden claws, poised to strike at the arteries of Japan's empire. But claws are useless without sharp talons, and as the months unfolded, the weapon meant to deliver the killing blow, the Mark 14 torpedo, proved to be disastrously flawed. In those early months, the Japanese high command underestimated the danger. Their military doctrine had been shaped by the victories of the Russo-Japanese War and refined through decades of naval exercises. At its heart was the concept of the decisive battle, a massive fleet engagement where battleships and carriers would crush the enemy in one climactic clash. Submarines were seen as scouts, shadowing enemy fleets, not as independent hunters. Convoy protection was lax. Destroyers often sailed with arrogance, their lookouts scanning the waves more for formality than vigilance. After all, the Americans had already demonstrated their weakness. If their submarines fired torpedoes that refused to explode, what real threat did they pose? The irony was cruel. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese aircraft had struck with precision and devastation. At sea, their torpedoes, modified with wooden fins to run shallow in the harbor, had shattered America's battleships with lethal efficiency. Japanese naval engineers had crafted weapons that were reliable, deadly, and battle-tested. In contrast, the Americans had clung to the Mark 14 torpedo, a weapon developed in secrecy during the interwar years, but one that had never been properly tested under combat conditions. Bureaucratic pride and budget constraints had prevented full-scale trials. As a result, the Navy sent its submariners into the Pacific armed with weapons that looked lethal on paper but betrayed them in battle. For the Japanese, it was further confirmation of their superiority. They laughed at reports of American duds, dismissing them as evidence of incompetence rather than of flawed design. Meanwhile, across the Pacific, American submariners found themselves in a war within a war. The enemy was not just the Japanese Navy, it was their own ordnance. Day after day, they risked their lives creeping into enemy waters, positioning themselves with precision, firing spreads of torpedoes at fat convoys, and watching in horror as explosions failed to materialize. Some torpedoes struck with a dull clang, bouncing off hulls like hammers against anvils. Others detonated prematurely, exploding harmlessly in the wake before reaching their target. Still others ran too deep, passing silently beneath ships without ever making contact. In Washington, these failures were met with disbelief. Admirals accused submarine captains of poor aim, of nervousness under fire, of exaggeration. Reports were buried, dismissed, or met with lectures about discipline. To the men at sea, it felt like betrayal from their own command. For Japan, these failures bought precious time. The empire expanded its perimeter, seizing bases and resources with methodical ferocity. Oil from Borneo and Sumatra flowed steadily toward refineries in the home islands. Convoys carried steel, bauxite, rubber, and food, sustaining the colossal war machine. Each successful delivery strengthened Japan's grip on Asia and fueled its armies across China and the Pacific. But beneath this apparent security lay a flaw as fragile as glass. The empire's entire strategy depended on uninterrupted shipping. Unlike Germany, which could draw on continental resources, Japan was an island nation, utterly dependent on imports. Every barrel of oil, every ton of ore, every sack of rice had to cross seas prowled by submarines. If those submarines ever solved their torpedo problem, the empire's lifelines would wither. In early 1942, Japanese admirals dismissed this possibility. Their war plans assumed American industry would be slow, clumsy, and ineffective. They believed the decisive fleet battle would come long before submarines could threaten their convoys. And with each passing month of unchecked expansion, their confidence grew. The Americans, after all, seemed incapable of stopping them. Submarines lurked, yes, but they struck like ghosts with broken swords. Convoys continued to reach their destinations, and Japanese soldiers marched deeper into enemy territory. In Tokyo, maps were shaded red, and victory speeches proclaimed the dawn of a new order in Asia. But beneath the surface of the Pacific, unseen battles raged. American submariners, frustrated and furious, continued their hunt. They documented failures with meticulous detail, collecting evidence that would eventually prove the truth. The fault lay not with the men but with the weapons. As months turned into years, this hidden struggle shaped the course of the Pacific War. Submarines remained the only American weapon, consistently striking at Japan's heart in 1942. But their blows were muffled by flawed torpedoes. Aircraft carriers would later steal the headlines with Midway and the island-hopping campaigns, but it was the submarine force that in the long war would starve Japan into submission. That outcome, however, was far from clear in the dark early days. Every failure deepened despair among the crews. Every unbroken convoy strengthened Japanese arrogance, and yet the seeds of Japan's downfall had already been sown. For while Japanese admirals laughed, their empire grew more dependent on fragile shipping lanes, and in hidden workshops and test ranges across America, engineers were closing in on the flaws that had crippled their torpedoes. The day would come when the laughter would die, replaced by the sound of convoys exploding in flame and steel. For now, in 1942, the Pacific was a battlefield defined by imbalance. Japan advanced with confidence, convinced of its naval superiority. America reeled, its submariners fighting not only the enemy, but the silence of faulty detonators and the arrogance of their own command. And yet, even in failure, the submarines were learning. Every dud torpedo was a clue, every failed patrol a lesson. The war beneath the waves was entering its most desperate chapter, and the stakes could not have been higher. If Japan's lifelines were ever to be severed, the Americans would first have to master their own weapons. Until then, the empire of the rising sun sailed on, its admirals laughing in chambers thick with smoke and sake, unaware that their laughter would one day echo back to them as the death knell of their convoys. Mid-1943. The Pacific Ocean, vast and unbroken, hid more than fleets and convoys. It concealed secrets. For nearly 2 years, American submariners had endured humiliation, firing torpedo after torpedo only to watch their prey slip away unharmed. Yet by the summer of that year, the tide of silence began to turn. Engineers and commanders finally faced the truth they had resisted. The Mark 14 torpedo, the Navy's supposed masterpiece, was a deeply flawed weapon. It ran too deep, often by more than 10 feet, its magnetic detonators were unreliable, and its contact pistols shattered on angled hits. To the sailors who had risked their lives only to be betrayed, these were not mere defects, they were nightmares made of steel. But once these flaws were admitted, investigated, and corrected, the hidden advantage of America's submarine fleet revealed itself like a blade drawn from a sheath. The breakthrough was born, not of theory, but of anger and defiance. Submarine captains, tired of being dismissed, began running unauthorized tests. Some fired live torpedoes at cliffs, others at captured wrecks, documenting their failures with irrefutable evidence. Reports arrived in Washington, dripping with sarcasm and fury. Finally, the Navy's Bureau of Ordnance could no longer deny the obvious. The detonators were redesigned, the depth-keeping systems recalibrated. What emerged was the weapon submariners had prayed for, a torpedo that exploded as intended, striking with devastating power. Now every American submarine lurking beneath the waves carried teeth sharp enough to rip the lifelines of Japan apart. The Japanese, however, remained blind to this shift. Their laughter lingered in war rooms and mess halls. They had grown accustomed to convoys slipping through ambushes, to submarines that barked but never bit. In their eyes, American torpedoes were clumsy contraptions, unworthy of respect. What they failed to grasp was that the Americans possessed something far more dangerous than technology. They possessed an industrial will, a relentless determination to adapt and overcome. Once the torpedoes were fixed, the submarine fleet was not merely effective, it was transformed into a predator unlike anything the Japanese had anticipated. The hidden advantage was not just in the weapon itself, but in the strategy that had been waiting all along. Unlike the Imperial Japanese Navy, which saw submarines as scouts, the Americans envisioned them as executioners. Their mission was not to shadow fleets, but to annihilate shipping. Every Japanese convoy, every tanker, every freighter was now a target. The Pacific was no longer safe, What had been a vast blue empire was suddenly a hunting ground where every shadow beneath the waves could be a wolf waiting to strike. By late 1943, the effects were unmistakable. Convoys that had once sailed confidently now moved with dread. Destroyers zigzagged in endless patrols, dropping depth charges at phantom contacts. Merchant captains, who once laughed at tales of American duds, now whispered about ships that vanished without warning, consumed by explosions that split steel like paper. Japanese admirals convened in tense councils, their confidence shaken. They had not prepared for this kind of war. They had not expected the Americans to turn the ocean itself into a battlefield where supply lines became killing grounds. The hidden advantage was multiplied by something the Japanese had never matched: coordination. American submarines, armed with reliable torpedoes, did not hunt blindly. They were guided by intelligence, by the growing mastery of radio intercepts and code-breaking. Every convoy had a schedule, every route a vulnerability, and the Americans began to learn them all. Submarine captains were no longer wolves wandering alone. They were part of a pack, directed with precision to strike where it would hurt most. For the Japanese, the laughter now began to sound hollow. Reports of lost ships multiplied. Tankers carrying vital oil from Borneo vanished into fireballs. Freighters laden with ammunition exploded in towering plumes of smoke. The once endless stream of supplies that fed Japan's empire began to thin drop by drop, like blood from a wound that would not close. Yet even as the evidence mounted, some admirals clung to arrogance, insisting that American victories were accidents, that their empire could not be strangled by submarines. They were wrong. The hidden advantage was psychological as much as it was technical. American submariners, once humiliated, now carried a weapon they trusted. Their confidence surged. Patrol reports, once filled with frustration, now read like chronicles of vengeance. Crews spoke of finally having a knife that cut. Each successful attack fueled morale, transforming submarines from steel coffins of despair into predators brimming with purpose. In Tokyo, the shift was felt like a chill draft creeping under a door. For every convoy that sailed, the question loomed: would it reach its destination, or would it vanish into the ocean's graveyard? The transformation of the Mark 14 torpedo symbolized something larger: the power of adaptation in war. The Japanese had laughed at American failures, secure in their early victories, but they failed to understand that American industry and ingenuity, once awakened, were forces of nature. The flaws that had once crippled the submarine fleet became lessons, and the solutions became weapons sharper than any steel blade. With every torpedo that now found its mark, the empire of the rising sun was pulled closer to collapse. By 1944, the hidden advantage could no longer be denied. Convoys that once sailed with pride now crept in fear, their decks lined with lifeboats prepared for the inevitable. Destroyer escorts strained to protect them, but the ocean was too vast, the hunters too many. Japan's laughter had faded into silence, replaced by desperate measures, rerouted convoys, and dwindling supplies. The advantage the Americans had unlocked was not only in technology, but in strategy, in coordination, and in the ruthless determination to strike at the enemy's heart. The Japanese admirals who once mocked American torpedoes now faced an empire that was slowly starving, its lifelines shredded. What had been hidden beneath the waves, an advantage dismissed, underestimated, and ridiculed, was revealed in the most brutal way possible: in burning convoys, in drowned soldiers, in the silence of ships that never arrived. The Americans had found their weapon, and with it, they had found the key to Japan's defeat. The laughter of the past was gone. In its place was the grim realization that the ocean itself had turned against them. The hidden advantage had become a nightmare, and Japan's empire, once so vast, now sailed on borrowed time. Beneath the roar of the Pacific War, in laboratories, shipyards, and factories scattered across the United States, the technical heart of the submarine campaign began to beat with clarity and precision. To understand the transformation, one must first understand the weapon at its center, the Mark 14 torpedo. On paper, it was the epitome of interwar engineering. 20 feet long, weighing over 3,000 pounds, powered by a steam-driven wet heater engine that could hurl it through the water at 46 knots for more than 4,000 yards. Its warhead carried 643 pounds of high explosive, more than enough to shatter the keel of a heavy cruiser or rip the belly from a fully loaded tanker. This was not a primitive weapon, it was a marvel of its time. And yet, for all its promise, it was crippled by flaws hidden beneath the layers of secrecy and pride that had surrounded its development. The Bureau of Ordnance, clinging to its reputation, had refused to subject the Mark 14 to live-fire testing against real targets. Instead, trials had been conducted with exercise heads, the explosive warheads replaced with inert weights. Torpedoes were fired into empty waters, their performance judged not by the violence of detonation but by the neatness of recovery. It was a culture of theory, not practice, of assumptions enshrined as truths. Thus, when war came, the Mark 14 carried within it three deadly flaws. First, its depth-keeping mechanism was miscalibrated, causing torpedoes to run as much as 10 to 15 feet deeper than set, a fatal error when aiming for merchant hulls designed with shallow drafts. Second, its magnetic influence exploder, designed to detonate beneath a ship's keel with catastrophic effect, was hopelessly unreliable, prone to premature detonation or complete failure. Third, its contact pistol, intended to trigger upon striking steel, often shattered or jammed when hitting at oblique angles. Together, these flaws turned a supposed masterpiece into a liability. For the men at sea, these flaws were not lines on a report, they were the difference between life and death. Imagine the tension of stalking a convoy through hostile waters, lining up the perfect shot, launching a spread, and then hearing only silence. Depth charges rained down in response, and the submarine was forced to flee, its crew cursing not the enemy but the weapon meant to save them. In frustration, captains conducted their own tests, firing torpedoes against cliff sides, collecting fragments of shattered exploders, and documenting the hard truth. These acts of rebellion were as courageous as any battle. They risked court-martial, but they laid bare the reality that bureaucracy had buried. Eventually, their persistence forced the Navy to acknowledge the disaster. Only then did engineers begin to strip the Mark 14 down to its bones, uncovering the flaws one by one. The solutions were born from both ingenuity and necessity. Depth mechanisms were recalibrated by live-fire testing against instrumented targets. The magnetic exploders, elegant in theory but treacherous in practice, were deactivated entirely by mid-1943. The contact pistols were reforged with hardened firing pins, capable of withstanding the brutal shock of angled impacts. Each correction brought the torpedo closer to the weapon it had always promised to be, and when the Mark 14 finally worked as intended, it was devastating. Submarine captains who once fired spreads of 4 or 6 torpedoes, praying for a single hit, now found their targets consumed by fire after a single shot. Confidence, once shattered, surged back. Behind this transformation lay the might of American industry. Companies like Westinghouse, General Electric and E.W. Bliss and Company churned out torpedoes in assembly lines that combined precision with mass production. Every component, from the gyroscopes that guided the weapon's course to the turbine wheels of its engine, was crafted with care, tested, and shipped to submarines heading into the Pacific. By 1944, thousands of torpedoes flowed from factories each month, a river of steel and explosive potential. It was a triumph of industrial warfare, America's ability not only to correct its mistakes, but to overwhelm them with sheer scale. The Japanese, by contrast, had their own torpedo marvel, the Type 93, known to history as the Long Lance. Powered by pure oxygen, it was a surface-launched weapon with unmatched range and explosive power, feared across the Pacific for its silent approach and devastating strikes in night battles. But the Japanese did not develop a submarine torpedo campaign on the same scale as the Americans. Their doctrine, rooted in fleet engagements, never envisioned submarines as predators of commerce. Thus, even as their long lances shattered enemy cruisers and destroyers in surface combat, they lacked the equivalent undersea weapon to sever enemy supply lines. It was a fatal blind spot. The Mark 14's resurrection revealed more than engineering. It revealed the American ability to adapt doctrine to weaponry. With reliable torpedoes, submarines could now fulfill their intended role, strangling Japan's economy. By 1944, submarines were sinking nearly half of Japan's merchant fleet each year. Tankers, once dismissed as too risky to target, became primary objectives. Every ton of oil lost was another nail in the Empire's coffin. The Mark 14, once mocked as useless, became the executioner's blade. Yet it was not only the weapon, but the men who wielded it, that made the difference. Submarine captains learned to exploit their tools with ruthless efficiency. They launched spread patterns to maximize hits, timed their attacks for moonless nights, and used radar, another American advantage, to strike with precision, even in darkness. Torpedoes, once wasted, now struck with deadly accuracy. In after-action reports, Japanese survivors spoke of convoys shredded in minutes, ships exploding like matchsticks struck against stone. The advantage was no longer hidden. It was undeniable, written in the smoke rising from shattered convoys across the Pacific. The technical deep dive also reveals something profound about warfare itself, that victory is not merely a matter of possessing the best weapon at the outset, but of the relentless pursuit of improvement. The Mark 14 had been a symbol of failure, of arrogance, of negligence. But in the crucible of war, it was reforged into a symbol of American resilience. Its numbers tell the story. By war's end, U.S. submarines, armed with corrected torpedoes, had sunk over 1,300 Japanese merchant ships and more than 200 warships. They accounted for 55% of all Japanese ships lost in the war, despite being only 2% of the Navy's personnel. That ratio was not an accident, it was the direct result of a weapon transformed from flawed steel to perfected death. For Japanese admirals who once laughed at the failures, the sound of the Mark 14's detonation became a grim drumbeat. Each explosion was a reminder that their mockery had been premature, their confidence misplaced. Convoys that once sailed proudly now crept in fear, haunted by the possibility that beneath every wave lurked an American submarine armed with a torpedo that would not fail. The hidden advantage had been revealed in full, forged in fire, sharpened by industry, and delivered with merciless precision. In the end, the story of the Mark 14 was not merely about a weapon, it was about the marriage of engineering, adaptation, and willpower. It was proof that in modern war, the path from failure to supremacy is paved by those who refuse to accept defeat. And as the Pacific War thundered on, this once broken torpedo became the very tool that turned laughter into silence, and silence into victory. September 18, 1944. The waters off Aricourt near the eastern coast of France were roiled with autumn storms in Europe. But halfway across the globe, in the Philippine Sea, a very different storm gathered. Japanese convoys, strung out in long lines of grey hulls, moved like veins of steel through the Pacific, carrying oil from Borneo, rice from Indochina, and iron ore from the Dutch East Indies. They were the arteries of an empire, pumping life into Japan's industrial heart. For months these lifelines had been struck piecemeal, but now the Americans, armed with reliable torpedoes and seasoned crews, were ready to strike with unrelenting precision. The ocean itself seemed to wait in silence, as if anticipating the carnage to come. The USS Harder, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Samuel Dealey, was one of the wolves poised to pounce. Known among fellow submariners as a submarine's submarine, Harder had already built a reputation for daring attacks. In June 1944, she prowled the waters off Tawi-Tawi, where the Japanese fleet had gathered before sailing to meet the Americans at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Harder slithered through the dark waters, stalking destroyers sent to guard the convoys. One by one, she struck, unleashing torpedoes that now, at last, detonated with thunderous fury. Within days, 5 destroyers had been sent to the bottom, an unprecedented achievement. Japanese survivors described the attacks as sudden eruptions of chaos, steel twisting, fire-consuming decks, men hurled into the sea. Admirals who had once mocked American torpedoes now raged in disbelief. 5 destroyers, gone, not from carrier planes or surface fleets, but from a single submarine armed with weapons that finally worked. The story of Harder was just one chapter in a larger saga of devastation. By the fall of 1944, American submarines had refined their tactics into a deadly art. Convoys were tracked relentlessly through the use of code-breaking. The Allies, having cracked Japan's merchant shipping codes, could direct submarines like chess pieces on a board, placing them in perfect position to intercept. Wolf packs, groups of 3 or more submarines, stalked convoys across the Philippine Sea, the South China Sea, and the approaches to Formosa. At night, their periscopes barely breaking the surface, they fired spreads of torpedoes that streaked unseen beneath the waves until they erupted against steel. Japanese convoys, once the proud arteries of empire, became floating funeral processions. One convoy in particular illustrates the transformation. Convoy Hi-72, September 1944. Laden with oil tankers and escorted by powerful destroyers, it set out from Singapore toward Japan. Unknown to its commanders, American codebreakers had read their signals. Submarines gathered along the convoy's route, waiting in silence. As the convoy advanced, the USS Flasher struck first, her torpedoes slamming into 2 tankers. Moments later, the USS Growler attacked from the flank, crippling another transport. Chaos erupted. Destroyers raced about in frantic zigzags, depth charges booming into the night, but the hunters were already gone, slipping beneath the thermocline, waiting to strike again. Over the next 3 days, submarine after submarine took its toll, until more than half the convoy lay at the bottom. Survivors clung to wreckage as burning oil spread across the water like a sheet of flame. To the Japanese command, it was a catastrophe. To the submariners, it was proof that the laughter of the early war had been silenced forever. The results were devastating not only in numbers but in symbolism. Reports from Japanese convoy commanders told of men breaking down, of crews refusing to sleep, of lookouts straining their eyes until bloodshot with fear. The enemy they had once ridiculed now haunted them with invisible terror. Unlike surface battles where fleets clashed in spectacle, submarine attacks came from nowhere, with no warning but the sudden roar of explosion. Survivors described the water itself as betraying them, concealing killers that no destroyer could fully protect against. The psychological toll was immense. By the close of 1944, the submarine campaign had become a relentless slaughter. At Leyte Gulf, as the great carrier fleets clashed in one of history's largest naval battles, submarines struck in tandem. The USS Data and USS Dace ambushed Vice Admiral Kurita's powerful center force in the Palawan Passage, sinking 2 heavy cruisers, including the flagship Otago. Torpedoes, once dismissed as duds, now shattered the backbone of the Imperial Navy's striking power. The sight of towering cruisers, their decks aflame, rolling helplessly into the sea, was a grim spectacle that announced the end of Japanese dominance on the waves. But perhaps the most telling evidence came not from warships but from the merchant fleet. By 1944, Japan's merchant marine had already lost over half its pre-war tonnage. Tankers, the lifeblood of the empire's oil supply, were hunted with particular ferocity. The U.S. Tang, under Commander Richard O'Kane, tore through convoys with deadly precision. In one patrol alone, Tang sank 10 ships, totaling over 39,000 tons. Japanese records, once filled with boasts of easy supply runs, now became ledgers of disaster. Convoy manifests were crossed out with notes of missing, presumed sunk. The empire that once laughed at American weapons now faced starvation. The success of these attacks was measured not just in ships sunk, but in the unraveling of Japanese logistics. Factories in Japan slowed to a crawl, starved of ore and fuel. Warships that survived battles could not sortie for lack of oil. Aircraft sat grounded for want of aviation fuel. Soldiers across the Pacific, cut off from resupply, grew gaunt and desperate, their rations dwindling. The hidden advantage of the submarine fleet had blossomed into a strategic stranglehold. It was not swift or spectacular like carrier battles, but it was inexorable. Japan's empire was bleeding out, one convoy at a time. The battles of 1944 stand as turning points. What had begun in humiliation in 1941 and 1942, the bitter taste of dud torpedoes, had now become a weapon of vengeance and precision. Submarines no longer endured laughter, they inspired terror. Japanese convoy commanders scribbled desperate notes in logs. Enemy submarines everywhere, protection inadequate, losses intolerable. The hunters had finally found their fangs and the results were catastrophic for the empire. The tale of Harder, of Flasher, of Tang, and countless others was not just the tale of steel and explosions. It was the story of men who refused to surrender to despair, who carried broken weapons into war and demanded they be fixed, who turned humiliation into triumph. Each submarine patrol was a chapter in a larger saga of resilience. Each convoy destroyed was another step toward victory. By the end of 1944, Japan's merchant fleet was on the verge of annihilation, and though battles still raged, the outcome was already being written in the depths of the Pacific, in the shattered hulls and burning tankers that marked the path of America's undersea wolves. By early 1945, the Pacific Ocean itself had become Japan's deadliest enemy. The convoys that once carried the empire's lifeblood, oil, rice, coal and steel, were now little more than floating coffins, each voyage a gamble against the unseen hunters beneath the waves. American submarines, armed with torpedoes that finally worked, did not just sink ships. They unraveled an entire strategy, a national lifeline, a vision of empire built upon maritime supply. What began as laughter in Tokyo war rooms had become grim silence, punctuated only by the roar of explosions echoing across the sea lanes. The strategic impact was devastating. At the outset of war, Japan had entered the conflict with roughly 6 million tons of merchant shipping. By the close of 1944, more than half of it lay at the bottom of the Pacific. Tankers, perhaps the most critical ships of all, were being annihilated faster than they could be replaced. Without oil, battleships became little more than floating fortresses, unable to sortie. Carriers, even those spared destruction in combat, were grounded by fuel shortages. Aircraft that once dominated Pacific skies now sat idle on cracked airstrips, their engines dry. A war machine that had once seemed unstoppable now withered from within, not by grand battleship duels, but by the slow, relentless tightening of an undersea noose. This was no accident of chance. It was strategy, cold and deliberate. American doctrine had shifted early. Submarines would not waste their time, shadowing fleets or dueling warships. Their mission was to choke the arteries of the empire, to kill not the sword but the hand that wielded it. Every merchant ship sunk was more than a statistic. It was fuel denied, rice withheld, ammunition undelivered. It was an infantryman left hungry in Burma, a fighter plane left grounded in the Marianas, a destroyer unable to leave port in Yokosuka. The war was not merely being fought on beaches and islands, it was being fought in the very silence of the ocean. The psychological toll of this campaign was profound. For American crews, who had endured the agony of firing duds in the early years, the reversal was almost intoxicating. Reports flowed back from patrols describing convoys torn apart, tankers split in half, destroyers floundering helplessly. The confidence of the submarine force soared. These were not mere sailors now, they were hunters, wolves beneath the waves, avenging the humiliation of Pearl Harbor and the bitterness of early failures. Submariners spoke with quiet pride of their role in strangling the empire, of dealing blows not in flashy battles, but in the endless grind of tonnage sunk. Their patrol reports read like grim poetry: 2 tankers destroyed, both aflame, convoy scattered, survivors in the water. Each line was a reminder that the tide had turned. For Japanese sailors, the experience was one of mounting terror. Convoy duty became a death sentence. Destroyer captains knew that no matter how they zigzagged, no matter how many depth charges they dropped, the enemy could strike again and again. Survivors of submarine attacks described the water itself as haunted, every ripple a possible periscope, every shadow a potential wake. Crews lived with nerves frayed to breaking, eyes straining in constant vigilance, ears ringing from the endless thunder of depth charges dropped at shadows. Even in harbors once considered safe, the fear lingered. Submarines had been known to slip into anchorages, loosing torpedoes at close range before vanishing into the dark. The contrast between American and Japanese command cultures amplified this psychological divide. In the US Navy, once the flaws of the Mark 14 were admitted, the submarine force adapted with ruthless efficiency. Captains were encouraged to take initiative, to strike boldly, to innovate tactics. Failures were studied, lessons absorbed, improvements made. In Japan, by contrast, rigidity stifled adaptation. Convoy protection remained inadequate. Destroyers were spread too thin, often pulled away to escort fleets rather than guard lifelines. The empire's strategic doctrine had never prioritized logistics, and when the crisis came, they had no answer. This imbalance was felt in every corner of the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers stranded on Pacific islands fought desperately on starvation rations, their supplies cut to ribbons by submarine attacks. In China, the once relentless Japanese offensive slowed, crippled by shortages of fuel and ammunition. On the home islands, factory workers labored in cold, dim workshops, production crippled by a lack of raw materials. Civilians queued in long lines for dwindling food supplies, as merchant losses brought hunger to the empire itself. The laughter of admirals in 1942 had become the growl of empty stomachs by 1945. Psychologically, the submarine campaign also reshaped the perception of modern warfare. The Japanese had envisioned war as a series of grand, decisive battles, a clash of fleets, carriers, and battleships. Instead, they found themselves defeated not in a single thunderclap, but in 1,000 cuts delivered silently beneath the waves. The very invisibility of the enemy was its greatest terror. Unlike air raids which could be seen approaching, or invasions which could be met with guns, submarines were shadows that struck without warning. The sense of helplessness spread like a disease. Crews dreaded patrol duty, merchants dreaded sailing, even admirals dreaded reading the reports that arrived with monotonous regularity. Another convoy gone, another tanker lost, another blow to the empire's veins. And yet, the psychological advantage was not merely one of fear, it was one of connection. American submarines, guided by reliable radios and coordinated intelligence, operated as a single organism. A convoy detected by one submarine could be relayed to another. Wolf packs could converge with mathematical precision. Destroyer escorts might cripple one submarine, but another was already in position to strike. By contrast, Japanese convoys, lacking robust communication systems and centralized coordination, often sailed in confusion. When a command ship was sunk, the convoy disintegrated into chaos. Survivors spoke of merchant captains scattering in panic, sailing alone into waters thick with submarines. What had begun as order quickly dissolved into slaughter. This disparity extended beyond the battlefield into the very soul of the two navies. Americans believed their submarines were wolves of a pack. The Japanese saw theirs as lone scouts. Americans viewed convoys as vital arteries to be severed. The Japanese dismissed them as secondary to the decisive fleet battle. In the crucible of the Pacific, it was clear which vision prevailed. Strategy was not about honor, but survival. It was not about glory in a climactic clash, but about starving the enemy of breath. By 1945, the strategic and psychological impact of the submarine campaign was irreversible. Japan's empire was bleeding to death, its fleets powerless, its armies starved, its people hungry. The ocean that had once carried conquest now carried ruin. American submarines, once mocked for their useless torpedoes, had become the arbiters of fate, and in the silence of the depths, amid the pressure and the darkness, they proved a lesson that echoes into modern warfare. Connection and adaptation outweigh arrogance and tradition. The hunters who had once endured laughter were now the authors of despair. In the final months of World War II, the Pacific lay strewn with the shattered remnants of Japan's maritime empire. Where once 6 million tons of merchant shipping had sailed confidently across the seas, less than 2 million remained. The ocean that had once been a highway of conquest was now a graveyard of steel. Convoys burned in endless procession, oil slicks stretching for miles across the horizon, lifeboats adrift with desperate men who knew rescue might never come. The laughter of admirals, once so confident, had been replaced by silence in war rooms thick with despair, and in that silence, the truth was undeniable. Japan had been strangled not by the clash of fleets alone, but by the invisible wolves beneath the waves. The legacy of this undersea war is measured not only in tonnage sunk, but in its transformation of strategy and doctrine. American submarines, just 2% of the Navy's manpower, were responsible for sinking more than half of all Japanese ships lost in the war. Their campaign crippled Japan's ability to sustain its forces, starving its armies and factories alike. For every cruiser sunk at Midway, for every carrier lost at Leyte, there were a dozen merchant ships torn apart in silence, their destruction less spectacular but far more decisive. Modern warfare had shifted. No longer would the decisive battle be measured only by the clash of battleships, but by the unseen severing of lifelines. Logistics had become the true heart of war, and submarines were its executioners. This truth resonated into the Cold War. In the years that followed, navies around the world re-examined the lessons of the Pacific. The United States embraced the doctrine of sea denial, building fleets of submarines designed not just to shadow enemies but to annihilate supply lines in the event of global war. Nuclear submarines, armed with missiles and silent as the grave, became heirs to the legacy of the Gaito and Balao classes that had prowled the Pacific. The lesson was clear: an enemy could be defeated not only in battles fought, but in supplies denied. From the Atlantic standoffs of NATO to the blockades envisioned in the Taiwan Strait, the specter of submarine warfare became a permanent fixture in strategy. Even beyond the Cold War, the echoes of the Pacific Campaign are unmistakable. In the Gulf War of 1991, coalition forces severed Iraq's logistics with precision, echoing the principle that without supply, armies collapse. In modern conflicts where drones and satellites now map the movement of every convoy, the lesson remains unchanged. Connection outweighs firepower, and the lifeblood of war is the ability to sustain. The submarine campaign of World War II proved that even the mightiest empire cannot survive once its arteries are cut. For veterans who survived the steel coffins of those submarines, the memory was bittersweet. They remembered the agony of firing dud torpedoes, of sweating in silence as depth charges hammered the hull. They remembered the despair of watching convoys sail unscathed. But they also remembered the moment the tide turned, when their weapons finally struck true, when flames rose from tankers and the ocean itself seemed to roar with vengeance. For them, the war was not about glory in great fleet battles, but about endurance, patience, and the relentless will to fight even when their tools betrayed them. Their legacy was not measured in medals or parades, but in the knowledge that their silent war had broken the empire's spine. For the Japanese, the legacy was one of bitter regret. Post-war interrogations revealed the disbelief that had gripped their naval command. They had mocked the Americans, dismissed their submarines, underestimated their industry. Even as convoys vanished, some clung to the illusion that the decisive battle would redeem them. But in the end, the war was not decided by battleships or carriers alone. It was decided by hunger, by fuel starvation, by factories silenced for lack of ore. The empire had been bled dry not by a single sword stroke, but by 1,000 cuts beneath the waves. One admiral admitted bitterly, "We built strong ships, but they were worthless without fuel to move them." Another confessed, "We laughed at their torpedoes. We are not laughing now." The story of the American submarine campaign is thus more than a tale of steel and explosions. It is a parable of adaptation. The Mark 14 torpedo, once a symbol of failure, became the instrument of victory when flaws were admitted and corrected. The submarine fleet, once humiliated, became the deadliest force in the Pacific when given weapons that worked. And the empire that laughed at its enemies discovered too late that arrogance is the deadliest weakness of all. As the war drew to its fiery close, with mushroom clouds rising over Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the world remembered the shock of atomic power. But beneath that shadow another truth endured, that long before the atom split the sky, it was the silent war beneath the waves that had already strangled Japan into submission. Without fuel, without food, without supply, the empire was doomed, and it was the submarines that sealed that fate. The lesson remains universal. In war, strength is not measured only in firepower, but in endurance, in the ability to adapt, in the capacity to strike not just the enemy's sword, but the hand that wields it. Japan's admirals laughed at American torpedoes, believing them harmless, a joke beneath the dignity of warriors. But when their convoys were torn apart, when their lifelines bled into the Pacific, the laughter died. The silence that followed was the sound of defeat. And so the narrator's voice fades, leaving one final truth to echo across history. In modern war, connection outweighs firepower, speed defeats armor, and the invisible hand of logistics decides the fate of nations. The submarines of World War II proved it. The Pacific became their stage, and in its depths they wrote the empire's epitaph.